Angel, Amy, and Jessica. None of us were experienced in winter sports, so the plan was simple. Laugh at our falls, enjoy the cold, and relax far away from everything. The place we chose looked like it was straight out of a movie. A cabin in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by snow-covered pine forests, with not a soul around. It was everything we wanted to disconnect from the hustle of everyday life. As soon as we hit the road, the landscape changed dramatically. The road was lined with an endless stretch of trees, and the silence from the snow piling up made everything feel almost surreal. Being so far away from everything felt liberating and a little scary at the same time. I couldn't stop thinking about how isolated we were, in the middle of that vast nothingness, and how anything could happen without anyone knowing. That thought gave me chills, but I tried to push it away and focus on the fun ahead. When we arrived at the cabin, I was surprised. It was even more charming than in the Airbnb photos. A rustic wooden building with a porch facing the forest. The absolute silence was both unsettling and comforting at the same time. As we walked through the snow toward the entrance, the sound of our footsteps seemed to echo, like the forest was watching us. We went inside, threw our stuff on the floor, and started exploring the cabin. There was a fireplace that we quickly lit, and the kitchen was well equipped. The coolest part? A hot tub outside, without a deck, with a view of the snow-covered trees. Everything seemed perfect. That first night, after dinner and warming ourselves by the fire, we planned the next day. We were so excited that I didn't even think about how deep the silence outside was. Like something was just waiting. When I went to bed, that mix of anxiety and excitement was still with me. Little did I know, the real cold wouldn't just come from the snow outside. Something much more unsettling was on its way. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and soft light coming through the window. I quickly got dressed, eager to finally try snowboarding. My friends were all ready, laughing and joking about who would fall the most in the snow. I laughed along, but deep down, I was a little nervous. The last time I tried snowboarding, I barely made it down a hill without tripping over myself. We arrived at the mountain and rented our gear. The area was amazing, with huge trails surrounded by tall trees. But I knew I wasn't going to venture too far, so I chose one of the easier slopes, the ones for beginners. The other girls were more confident and went straight for the more exciting trails. I was slowly going down, trying to keep my balance, when I felt someone watching me. I looked around and saw a guy, probably my age, with a friendly expression. He seemed just as awkward on a snowboard as I was. He smiled and nodded. I gave a polite smile back and continued my awkward attempt to go down the slope. A little while later, when I stopped to rest and catch my breath, there he was again. This time, he moved closer and started a conversation. He asked if I was doing okay and said he was also having a hard time. I responded briefly, trying to be polite, but there was something off about the way he spoke. It didn't seem like he just wanted a casual conversation. It was like he was trying to probe, to figure something out. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but that feeling of unease was hard to shake. I tried not to think too much about it. I stood up and continued down the mountain, but he kept following. Every time I stopped, he seemed to appear, and then his questions started getting more personal. He wanted to know who I was with, where we were staying. My instincts started telling me something was wrong, so I lied and said I was there with my boyfriend, hoping that would make him back off. But he just laughed and said he saw me arrive with my friends, like he had been watching me from the start. That sent chills down my spine, and it wasn't because of the cold mountain air. I needed to get away from him. His laugh echoed in my head as I tried to keep it together. I didn't say anything else, just forced a smile and got back on my snowboard, going down the mountain faster than before. I could feel my heart racing, and with every second that passed, the feeling of unease just grew stronger. When I reached the bottom of the mountain, I quickly glanced over my shoulder. He was no longer in sight, and for a moment I thought maybe I was overreacting. But the truth is, deep down, I knew he hadn't just disappeared. There was something about the way he watched me that made me feel vulnerable. I went straight to the lodge, found a table, and sent a message to the girls in our group chat. Amy was the first to respond. As soon as she arrived, I told her what had happened. She looked at me with a mix of concern and disbelief, but didn't say anything right away. A few minutes later, Angel and Jessica showed up, and I repeated the story. I didn't want to alarm anyone, but something in my voice must have made it clear that I was scared. We decided it was time to leave anyway, as we had been on the mountain for hours. So we returned our gear, grabbed an Uber, and headed back to the Airbnb. On the way back, I couldn't stop looking out the window, expecting to see the guy lurking somewhere, maybe following us. But nothing happened. The ride was smooth, and for a moment, I thought the sense of danger had finally passed. We got back to the cabin, showered, changed, and tried to relax. We decided to go out for dinner and visit a few local bars afterward. I was determined to forget what had happened earlier, and for a few hours it worked. We laughed, drank, and for a while, everything felt normal again. But when we got back to the Airbnb, something changed. We were a bit tipsy. All four of us piled into the hot tub on the deck, and the relaxed atmosphere seemed to have returned. However, the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling lingered, whispering at the back of my mind. As the night went on and we finally headed to bed, that feeling hit me full force. I lay down, scrolling through TikTok, trying to distract myself, but I couldn't shake the thought that something was wrong. And then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard footsteps. The footsteps were slow, almost dragging. At first, I thought it was one of the girls, maybe getting some water or heading to the bathroom. But then the sound continued, light but steady footsteps, crossing the living room and getting closer. I immediately tensed up in bed, feeling my heart race again. Still lying in the dark, with only the light from my phone illuminating my face, I heard the doorknob to my room jiggle. It was a subtle click, but enough to make me hold my breath. For a second, I almost called out to one of the girls, but something stopped me. Why would they be trying to get into my room in the middle of the night? I grabbed my phone and quickly opened the group chat, typing, "Who's walking around the house?" I hit send, expecting an immediate response. Nothing. No one replied. I held my breath and moved closer to the door, pressing my ear against it. I could hear heavy footsteps on the other side, pacing back and forth. Whoever it was, they were going from room to room like they were checking or searching for something. My heart pounded in my chest as I silently unlocked the door and cracked it open just enough to peek out. The dim light from the living room spilled in, illuminating part of the hallway. That's when I saw him, a tall, dark figure walking from one door to the next. I couldn't see his face, but I knew it was him, the same guy from the mountain. That eerie feeling washed over me again, freezing me in place. He was trying to open the other bedroom doors. My friends were still asleep, completely unaware of what was happening. I wanted to scream, to warn them, but the words just wouldn't come out. I stood there watching as he tested each doorknob one by one. I closed my door as quietly as I could, locking it again. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Then, with trembling hands, I dialed 911. I whispered as softly as possible, trying not to alert him that I was awake, explaining that someone had broken into our cabin. Every second felt like an eternity. As I spoke on the phone, the footsteps started getting closer to my door. He was now right outside, testing the doorknob again. A chill ran down my spine as I heard soft knocks on the door, followed by another turn of the knob, like he was trying to force his way in. My heart was in my throat as I whispered to the operator, "Please hurry." The knocks on the door grew louder. I could hear the knob turning harder now, like he was really trying to get in. My whole body was tense, caught between the urge to scream and the fear of making any noise. The phone was still in my hand, and the operator told me to stay calm, that the police were on their way. But I had no idea how much longer this would go on. Then he started pushing against the door. I could feel the wood vibrating with each shove, like he was testing how much the lock could hold. The sound of the pounding and pushing was deafening in the silence of the night, each hit making me jump a little. I couldn't control the shaking in my hands anymore. Finally, I couldn't hold the fear in any longer and shouted, "Get out! I'm on the phone with the police!" My scream echoed through the house, and for a second, everything went silent on the other side of the door. I stood frozen, breathless, listening for any movement. His response came almost like a whisper, but the word chilled me to my core. "Okay, sweetheart." It was the casual, disturbingly calm way he said it that sent a shiver down my spine. I heard his footsteps retreating from my door, moving back down the hallway. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like I could hear it. Was he leaving, or just changing his plan? The operator kept talking in my ear, but I could barely process her words. "They're almost there. Stay where you are. Don't go out." I peeked through the window, trying to spot any sign of lights or movement outside, but it was no use. It was too dark to see anything. My friends were finally waking up, probably from the sound of my scream. I heard one of them ask, in a low voice, what was happening, but I couldn't risk speaking out loud. Instead, I quickly sent a message in the group chat. "Stay in your rooms. He's here." After what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, a sound that had never been so comforting. The sirens were getting closer, and for the first time that night, I felt a glimmer of hope. I kept watching out the window, desperate to see the red and blue lights cutting through the darkness. The intruder's footsteps had completely disappeared, but I knew he was still out there, maybe hiding somewhere. Then I heard the front door creak and slowly open. The fear that he might be trying to get back inside almost made me lose control. Suddenly, the lights finally broke through the darkness. The police arrived quickly, and when the car doors slammed open, it felt like the tension shattered for a moment. Even so, I didn't dare leave my room. The dispatcher told me to stay locked in until the police had swept the house. I heard loud knocks on the front door, followed by an authoritative voice. "Police! We're coming in." Relief washed over me, but I was still trembling as I waited to hear the words that would free me from this fear. The voices of the officers echoed through the house as they checked every corner. Finally, after what felt like long minutes, there was a soft knock on my door. "It's the police, you're safe now." I unlocked the door slowly, still shaking, and cracked it open to see two officers, their flashlights lighting up the dark room. I stepped out, in shock, not knowing what to say or think. They confirmed that the intruder was gone, but the feeling of safety still seemed far away. The house was intact, but every door had been unlocked. They searched the surrounding area, but he had vanished into the darkness without a trace. When the girls finally came out of their rooms, they were pale and terrified. We gathered in the living room, trying to process what had just happened. The scariest part was that, despite everything, nothing seemed to have been stolen. He wasn't there to rob us. The only thing he did was watch us, stalk us, and that voice, that "okay, sweetheart," kept echoing in my mind, like a promise that he knew way more about us than we wanted to believe. The next day, exhausted and still in shock, we decided we couldn't spend another night there. We managed to convince the Airbnb host to give us a partial refund and spent Sunday exploring the area instead of going back to the slopes. But I couldn't relax. His image was still stuck in our heads. When we finally got home, it was an indescribable sense of relief, but the feeling that he could still be watching us, that he knew who we were, that didn't fade so easily. After my father passed away, everything turned upside down. He had a cabin in a remote area of Oregon, near Mount Bachelor. It was the kind of place he loved, isolated, peaceful, in the middle of a dense forest. With the paperwork for selling the cabin nearly complete and knowing it wouldn't be ours for much longer, I decided to spend a few days there, away from everything, before it went on the market. It made sense, you know? I'd probably clear my head, and that place had been a kind of refuge for my dad. I grabbed my dog, Midnight, and packed the basics: food, drinks, my snowboard, and my dad's old car. I was determined to spend a few days alone, away from the immediate chaos that life had become. Up there, in the solitude of the mountain, I thought maybe I'd find some peace. The cabin was simple, 2 stories of rustic wood, surrounded by miles of forest with only 2 other cabins at a considerable distance. It was covered in snow like the whole world was frozen in time, and you could barely see the roof because of how high the snow had piled up. It was exactly what I was looking for. Absolute silence and distance from everything and everyone. The first 2 days, the feeling of being completely alone was almost liberating. I spent the mornings playing with Midnight in the snow, took my snowboard to the nearby slopes, and at night, I'd settle into the living room, playing PlayStation or watching some old movies I'd brought with me. It was nice, simple, peaceful. But while the silence was initially relaxing, I slowly started to notice something different about it. It wasn't just the solitude I had expected. It felt like the quiet there was heavy. You know that feeling like something is watching you, even when you're completely alone. I tried to ignore it, convinced myself it was just my mind creating something out of nothing. After all, it was just an old cabin in the middle of the woods, right? But as time went on, that feeling, that I wasn't as alone as I thought, became harder to ignore. Then, on the 3rd day, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. I was outside playing with Midnight, throwing snow for him, when I spotted something strange on the ground. Footprints. In the soft, freshly falling snow around us, there was a trail of fresh footprints circling the cabin. I stopped playing and took a closer look. They weren't mine, that much was clear, and Midnight had been running around everywhere, so they weren't his either. These were human footprints, wide and deep, like someone had been there not too long ago. And the worst part, they started and ended at odd points, like the person had come from the direction of the trees and disappeared the same way, with no continuous trail. I tried to stay calm, telling myself maybe it was someone from one of the nearby cabins. But logic didn't help much because I knew the other cabins had been empty since I arrived. I had seen the snow undisturbed around them the first few days. There hadn't been any sign of life nearby. And besides, the footprints were so close to my cabin, almost circling it, like someone had been watching me. I went back inside, taking Midnight with me, trying to ignore the growing discomfort in my chest. I sat on the couch, turned on the TV, but my mind couldn't stop replaying the sight of those footprints. The day dragged on with that thought gnawing at me, and every time I looked out the window, the snow kept falling, but the footprints were still there, marked, reminding me that someone or something had been close enough to be a threat. Night fell, and with it, the oppressive silence of the forest. I didn't want to admit it, but I started feeling like this wasn't a coincidence. Someone was out there, watching. As the night wore on, the silence inside the cabin felt more and more suffocating. I tried to distract myself with the TV and the sound of the wind outside, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. Midnight, usually a calm dog, started acting strangely. He suddenly stood up, ears perked, as if he heard something I couldn't. The first time he did it, I didn't think much of it, but when he jumped off the bed and ran downstairs, my heart raced. I sat there, frozen, trying to understand what was happening. The sound of his paws running across the living room floor echoed through the cabin. I heard a slight thud, then silence. I waited a moment, trying to stay calm, and then called out, "Midnight, come back here." Nothing. I could feel the fear growing in the pit of my stomach. Finally, I mustered the courage, grabbed my phone, and slowly headed downstairs, my feet making the wooden floor creak with every step. When I reached the bottom, I saw Midnight standing by the front door, his nose pressed to the floor. He was agitated, like he had picked up a scent that didn't belong there. I approached, trying to calm him down, but he seemed fixated on something. His eyes were focused in the direction of the window, and that's when I realized he wasn't just sniffing the ground. He was looking at the ceiling, as if something was up there, outside the cabin. My heart started pounding, and my mouth went dry. "What is it, boy?" I whispered, trying to keep my fear in check. But Midnight remained on edge, sniffing the air and staring at the ceiling as if he sensed something I couldn't. My survival instincts started kicking in. I knew something wasn't right. Midnight's behavior, the footprints around the cabin, the oppressive silence outside. It was all creating a sense of imminent danger. I wanted to believe it was just paranoia, but something inside me knew it wasn't. I tried to push the fear aside, took a deep breath, and led Midnight back upstairs. But that night, even lying in bed, I couldn't close my eyes. I knew that whatever it was close, and it wasn't going away anytime soon. A few minutes after I got back into bed, still trying to wrap my head around what was happening, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It sounded like footsteps, but not inside the house, on the roof. It wasn't the noise of something small, like branches or pine cones falling. These were footsteps, heavy and spaced out, like someone or something was walking across the cabin's roof. Midnight, who had been lying at the foot of the bed, perked up immediately, his ears standing straight, completely alert. He started to growl, a low, deep rumble I had never heard from him before. My heart was pounding so hard it echoed in my head. Whatever was outside wasn't just any animal. I got up slowly, trying to stay quiet. I grabbed my flashlight and went over to the sliding glass door that led to the balcony, hoping to see if I could figure out what was going on. When I opened the curtains and looked into the darkness, it took a moment for my eyes to adjust. At first, I didn't see anything. But then, as I swept the roof with my flashlight, I saw something that made me freeze. Between the trees, about 20 feet up, crouched on a branch, was a figure. It was perched in a way that seemed almost impossible, squatting between two limbs, its slender body and long white arms stretched up, gripping the branch above. It was thin, far thinner than any human should be, and its skin was pale, almost translucent under the weak beam of my flashlight. The most disturbing part was its face, or the lack of expression on it. Its mouth was open, but it wasn't making a sound. It just watched me. I stood still, my whole body frozen with fear, as Midnight growled beside me, shifting his paws restlessly. I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't human, but it wasn't an animal either. It was something different, something that shouldn't be there. My mind screamed at me to run, to lock myself in the bedroom and call for help. But at the same time, a part of me told me not to make any sudden movements. Like, somehow, this thing was waiting for me to react. It didn't move. It stayed crouched on the branch, its long white arms hanging down, and its eyes, if it had any, fixed on me. I started backing away slowly, pulling Midnight with me, never taking my eyes off it. I closed the balcony door with trembling hands and pulled the curtains shut. I knew that wouldn't be enough. I shut the curtains with my heart in my throat and crawled back into bed, pulling Midnight up with me. He was still restless, pacing back and forth, but he didn't bark, like he knew that making any noise could attract unwanted attention. I huddled under the covers, trying to stop my mind from imagining what that thing was, or what it wanted. But the night was far from over. A few minutes later, I heard a sound. This time, it came from the glass door to the balcony. Soft taps, almost like someone was scratching the glass with their fingers. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just the wind, a branch, anything other than what I feared. But the tapping continued, rhythmic and insistent, like someone was trying to get my attention. I knew it was that thing. Every instinct in my body screamed at me not to look, not to open the curtains. But it was like I was being pulled, an irresistible urge to acknowledge its presence, to confirm that it was there. I curled up in bed, gripping the blanket so tightly my fingers hurt, and the tapping wouldn't stop. Midnight moved away from the door, but this time he didn't growl. He just stood there, staring intently at the curtain, as if he knew something was behind it, but couldn't summon the courage to react. Then something even stranger happened. In the middle of the constant tapping, I started to hear a voice, low and soft, almost like a whisper. "Open the door." It wasn't a command, but more of an invitation. The voice was slow, like it was struggling to come out, and it made my stomach churn. Whoever or whatever it was trying to lure me outside. I knew I couldn't open the door. Every rational part of me told me to stay put, but it was like the voice was inside my head, urging me, manipulating my thoughts. I was frozen, listening to that thing whisper and tap on the glass for almost an hour, until finally the tapping stopped. The silence returned, but I knew I wasn't safe. Not while that thing was out there, waiting. I could barely breathe, anticipating the next sound, the next tap, the next attempt for it to get in. But that night, it didn't come inside. I stayed awake until dawn, my body tense and fear gnawing at every part of my mind. When the sun finally started to rise on the horizon, I felt a small sense of relief seeing the first rays of light creep into the room. The darkness of the night had drained all my energy, and the daylight brought a sense of security, though I knew I couldn't relax just yet. Midnight seemed calmer too, but every now and then, he'd still glance at the glass door, as if expecting something to move outside again. I got up, my legs trembling from exhaustion and fear. I walked slowly to the window, opening a small gap in the curtains, just enough to peek outside. And there they were, footprints, not just around the cabin, but completely encircling it. It was like that thing, or maybe more than one, had spent the entire night circling the house, going from window to window, maybe watching, waiting, looking for a way in. Long, spaced-out footprints, exactly like I had imagined during the night. What disturbed me the most was that some of them were way too close to the windows, as if that thing had stopped at each one, waiting for me to make the slightest move. I couldn't stay there another second. Without thinking twice, I grabbed my things in a rush, throwing clothes and belongings into my bags without any care for organization. I called Midnight, and he came immediately, as if he knew it was time to leave. By this point, the fear was so overwhelming I could barely think straight. I locked all the doors and windows of the cabin, but I knew it wouldn't make much of a difference. Whatever had been out there wasn't interested in breaking in. It seemed to be toying with me, testing my limits, waiting for me to slip up. I got into the car, with Midnight by my side, and sped down the snow-covered road. Glancing in the rearview mirror, the cabin grew smaller and smaller, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. Even far away, I still felt like that thing was following me, hidden among the trees, always lurking. When I finally reached the main road, I felt a wave of relief, but I knew that, even now, it wouldn't leave my mind anytime soon. The cabin, the footprints, that voice, it would all stay with me for a long time. And deep down, one question wouldn't leave me. What exactly had been watching me that night? And more importantly, would I ever see it again? I've always loved spending winter in Vermont. My family owns a property there, at the top of a hill, surrounded by woods and snow. The house is the perfect place to relax, disconnect, and enjoy the peace. Especially in winter, when the snow covers everything, and you feel like you're in a world of your own. That weekend, I decided to head up there with a girl named Melissa. I was excited to teach her how to snowboard, since she had never tried it before, and our property had a sloped hill we used to practice on before heading to the real mountains. The house was large, with 3 floors. The top floor was reserved for my parents, and we had to settle for the lower rooms, but that was never a problem. When we got there, everything was just as I remembered it. A cabin at the top of a hill, surrounded by forest, with fresh snow covering the ground. The shed outside, where we stored our snowboarding gear and gardening tools, was still there, locked up, waiting for us to open it. As soon as we arrived, we unpacked our gear and got things ready. The plan was to teach Melissa the basics right there on our makeshift slope before taking her to the bigger mountain. The weather was perfect. The snow reflected the soft glow of the winter sun, and the silence was almost absolute, except for the muffled sounds of our footsteps in the snow. First, everything went as expected. I went down the hill, showing her the basic moves, and she tried to imitate them, falling over and laughing at herself every time. Each time she got up, she was a little more confident, and soon we were having a lot of fun. But even with all the peace, I couldn't help but notice how absolute the isolation was. The silence around the property was almost eerie, like there was no one else for miles. And, in a way, that feeling of isolation had always made me love the place more. Up there on that hill, you feel untouchable, like the rest of the world can't reach you. But later, something happened that made that isolation feel a lot less comforting, and much more unsettling. We were in the middle of another run, laughing at Melissa's falls, when we heard something that made me stop in my tracks. It was a voice, a man's voice, calling out from within the forest. "Hello!" My first reaction was confusion. I looked around, expecting to see someone among the trees, but all I could see was the white snow covering the ground and the still trunks of the trees. Melissa stopped too and looked at me, clearly unsettled. The sound had been clear, but there was no one in sight. I stood there, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. The voice echoed for a few seconds, then was swallowed by the absolute silence of the forest. "Is someone there?" I shouted back, my voice sounding more hesitant than I would have liked. I waited for a reply, but there was nothing, just the heavy, endless silence. Melissa looked at me, her eyes wide, as if waiting for me to explain what was happening, but I had no answers. "Maybe it's someone hiking through the forest," I tried to say, but I didn't even believe it myself. After all, who would be walking around alone out here? And why couldn't we see them, especially with all that snow reflecting the light? The forest was open, and anyone should have been easily visible. I stood still for a few more seconds, listening. The sound of the wind gently blowing through the trees seemed louder now, like it was masking any other noise that might come from the forest. After another moment of absolute quiet, I decided to let it go. "It's probably just one of the neighbors," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. We headed back to the cabin, but that uneasy feeling started settling in me. I couldn't shake the strange sense that we were being watched. But still, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But the way that voice had echoed through the air, so close and so out of place, wouldn't leave my mind. We tried to forget about it and move on with our day. We went back to the cabin, warmed up a bit, and then decided to go out for dinner at a nearby restaurant. We stopped by the market to grab a few things, and as night fell, the discomfort I had felt earlier started to fade. We laughed, ate well, and even joked about what had happened earlier. Maybe it was just some lost or curious guy, nothing to worry about. When we returned to the cabin, everything was just as we had left it. The usual quiet of the place seemed back to normal, and I started to relax. We had dinner, drank some wine, and hung out in the living room, enjoying the warmth of the fireplace. The snow continued to fall softly outside, and everything felt peaceful again. But then, late at night, when we were about ready to go to bed, we heard something again. This time, it was different from what we'd heard in the woods. This time, it was the distinct sound of footsteps in the snow. Heavy, slow, as if someone was walking around the cabin. I turned off the music that was playing to listen more closely, and then it became clear. Someone was out there. The sound of the footsteps was getting louder, like they were approaching the house. Melissa froze, her eyes meeting mine with a mix of fear and confusion. I stood up, trying to act like I was in control of the situation, but deep down, I knew something was very wrong. I grabbed my phone and a flashlight, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer, but the sound of the footsteps, they were too human. I looked out the window, but the darkness outside was thick, and even with the snow reflecting the light, I couldn't see anyone. I took a deep breath and went to the back door. The cold wind hit my face as I opened it, and with the flashlight in hand, I shone it toward the forest. "Is someone there?" I shouted again, this time more firmly, but silence was the only response. Just the sound of the snow falling and the creaking of the wood in the wind. No movement, no sign of life. I knew Melissa was terrified, and honestly, so was I. We shut the door quickly and went back inside. "It was probably just an animal," I said, trying to convince myself more than her. But something inside me knew that wasn't true. There was something out there, something that was circling us. I just didn't know what it was or what it wanted. That night, the tension only grew. The feeling that something was nearby wouldn't leave us. And I knew this wouldn't be the last time we heard those footsteps. The night finally passed, but I barely got any sleep. The sound of those footsteps still echoed in my mind, and the feeling that we were being watched wouldn't leave me alone. When I woke up in the morning, Melissa wasn't in bed. For a second, I thought maybe she had gone to the bathroom or was downstairs making coffee, but a wave of unease quickly washed over me. I got up and went to the window. The first thing I noticed was the shed outside. The door was open, and what made me tense up even more was seeing the vapor of someone's breath coming from behind the door, like they were hiding. My first thought was shock. What was Melissa doing outside so early? Why would she have gone to the shed? I opened the window a bit and called out, "Melissa, what are you doing out there?" But what happened next made my blood run cold. From inside the house, from the living room, I heard Melissa's voice respond, "What? I'm right here." Instinctively, I whipped my head around toward the living room, and there she was, standing by the couch, looking at me with a confused expression. A shiver ran down my entire body. Whoever was outside wasn't Melissa. Panic took over, and without thinking, I ran to the back door. I could see the silhouette of someone, a tall figure, dressed in black, walking quickly toward the forest. I wanted to chase after them. I wanted to know who it was, but logic kicked in. Could it be dangerous? What if they were armed? I knew I couldn't take the risk. I looked at Melissa, who was now pale as a sheet, and said, "Lock all the doors and windows. Now." I ran out to the shed to see if anything had been stolen, but everything was in place. The door had just been left slightly ajar, like whoever had been there was trying to get in, but wasn't in a hurry, almost like they were waiting for something. I locked the shed and hurried back inside, my mind racing. The strangest part was that, besides the footprints leading back to the woods, there was no other sign that anyone had been there. Nothing was broken, nothing seemed disturbed, but I knew it wasn't over. Someone, or something, had been watching us from the moment we arrived. And now I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't finished yet. That night, the tension was almost palpable. After locking all the doors and windows, we tried to laugh it off. We watched a movie, had dinner, but the feeling that something was off never completely left. Melissa was visibly on edge, and to be honest, so was I. That figure by the shed, I couldn't get it out of my head. What were they doing there? And why were they watching us? It was around 2 in the morning when Melissa shook me awake, pulling me out of a light, restless sleep. Her eyes were wide with fear, and she whispered in a trembling voice, "Did you hear that?" I stayed still, trying to listen for anything outside. The silence of the night was oppressive, but then, out of nowhere, came that sound. A voice, from outside, slow and thin, almost like a wail. "Help me?" It was a cry for help, but something was wrong with the tone. Sounded off, like someone was faking it, and that sent a chill through me instantly. Melissa was panicking now. "What is that? Who's out there?" I got up and went to the window, fighting the urge to stay put and pretend nothing was happening. When I lifted the edge of the curtain to peek out, all I saw was darkness. The snow reflected a bit of the moonlight, but not enough to see anything beyond the edge of the forest. The voice came again, louder this time. "Help me?" It was slow, drawn out, like it was a distorted echo. A shiver ran through my body. That didn't sound like a genuine plea for help. It was more like a trap. Melissa was on the verge of total panic, so I tried to keep her calm. "Stay here. I'm just going to take a look," I whispered. She gripped my arm tightly. "Please don't go." But I knew I had to figure out what was going on. I grabbed a flashlight and carefully opened the window just enough to hear better. The voice seemed closer now, but still, nothing was in sight. Suddenly, everything changed. Footsteps. Quick footsteps in the snow, getting louder, closer. Someone was coming toward the cabin. I slammed the window shut and locked it, my hands shaking as Melissa whimpered softly, hiding under the blanket. The footsteps stopped right next to the window. I could hear someone's breathing, heavy and uneven. I tried not to make a sound, knowing that any movement could trigger something terrible. Then, I heard a soft, almost delicate tap on the window, like someone gently knocking with their fingers. It was at that moment I realized, whoever was out there already knew we were listening. They already knew we were awake. Melissa was in silent hysteria now, and I knew our best chance was to stay quiet, not respond. We couldn't open the door, we couldn't open the window. The voice kept going, repeating that distorted and empty "help me." And the tapping on the window didn't stop. The night dragged on. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think about anything other than whatever was out there. I knew the worst was yet to come. Those taps on the window went on longer than I'd like to admit. It was as if whoever was outside knew exactly what they were doing, trying to drive us insane, break our calm, force us to do something impulsive. Each soft knock was like a growing pressure on my chest. The "help me" voice became sporadic, but the sound of footsteps around the house told me that whatever it was hadn't left. Finally, around 4 in the morning, the silence returned. But it wasn't the usual kind of silence. It was dense, almost suffocating. Melissa and I didn't say a word. We just lay there, motionless, waiting for something else to happen. But the minutes dragged on, and all we could hear was the sound of our ragged breaths and the creaking of the cabin's wood. When the sun finally began to rise, the light pouring into the room felt almost like a blessing. The darkness that had seemed to surround us all night began to fade, and the tension that had gripped both of us gave way to a heavy relief, as if we'd been released from some invisible prison. But I knew that didn't mean the danger had passed. We needed to get out of there, and fast. I got up, opened the curtain just a little, and looked outside. What I saw sent a chill down my spine. Footprints. Footprints everywhere, circling the house like a ring, going from window to window. It was as if whoever had been out there had been watching us all night, never really leaving. I didn't say anything to Melissa right away, but she noticed the change in my expression. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. I knew there was no point in lying. Someone was walking around the house, all night. Her eyes widened, and I could see the fear flooding back into her. I knew she wouldn't want to stay another second in that cabin. We packed our things quickly, barely speaking, the silence only broken by the sound of our hurried movements. When we finally stepped outside, the sunlight seemed almost surreal, shining bright on the snow, as if what had happened the night before was just a nightmare. But the footprints around the house were far too real to ignore. I glanced at the tracks on the ground one last time before locking the door. The footprints weren't just from one person. It looked like there were several. Whoever, or whatever, had been there wasn't alone. That thought made me shudder, and all I wanted was to get us out of there as fast as possible. On the drive back home, the silence between us was heavy. Melissa was pale, and I could still feel the fear hanging over us. Even far from the cabin, the sense that we were being watched wouldn't leave me. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror every few minutes, half expecting to see something or someone following us. Thankfully, I never saw anything. When we finally made it back to Rhode Island, we left it all behind. We didn't bring it up again. But one thing is certain. Something or someone was after us that weekend. And I'm not sure what was worse, the fact that we never found out who it was, or the feeling that, all along, it had been waiting for something more. Since that day, I've never gone back to Vermont.